Pop culture arose in the 1920s. It was a time of fun, excitement, and great fashions. They didn't call it the Roaring Twenties for nothing.
Fashion of the 1920s, an era known as the Roaring Twenties, was the age of the flappers. Hair and hemlines became shorter, hats got bigger, and makeup became bolder. Men's fashion had the gangster look to it with pinstripe suits and fedoras.
Music in the 1900s really represented people's moods during the time periods. For example, in the 1920s, there was jazz music when everyone was upbeat during the Roaring Twenties. Some famous jazz musicians are Handy Morton, Joe King Oliver, Duke Ellington, and Al Jolson. The most famous jazz musician was Louis Armstrong. He made the song All of Me, When the Saints Go Marching In, and What a Wonderful World. These songs are still popular.
Here we are for sports, and we're going to go back in time and talk about what went down in the 1920s. And first, it all started with the National Football League, which formed. And obviously, it's a big hit and still the number one watch sports, the sport today. Then the Negro Leagues became big. This is where Jackie Robinson, Bob Gibson, and all the other famous black athletes came famous. The New York Yankees had Babe Ruth, the greatest baseball player to ever live, and he hit 54 home runs in the 1920s. Also, the first ever Winter Olympic Games were held, and the Summer Olympic Games, for mostly track and field, was the biggest events. And they introduced, in 1922, the first 100-meter freestyle swimming race. The French Open is a big tennis tournament, and this is the first year when they allowed it for just everyone in the country. It used to be only for French players. And then women. Obviously, women were a big deal in the 1920s, and this is where they got their rights for sports. Although they were allowed to participate in the Olympics and the gymnastics in 1928, 4 years after the first ever Olympics. And Dixie Dean scored 60 league goals in 39 matches as Everton FC wins the National Football League, like soccer football league back then.
The first commercial broadcast of a commercial radio station was on November 2nd, 1920, at Westinghouse House Corporation's KDKA, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, airing reports on the Harding-Cox presidential election results by 1920.
In early 1920s, silent movies were the latest trend. They were soon replaced by talkies or talking movies. As the movie industry began to grow, Hollywood in South California quickly became the movie capital of the world because it enjoyed long hours of sunshine among other advantages. The earliest movies were not required to follow a code of censorship, but the outraged public soon forced the screen magnates to establish one. The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson, became the first talkie upon its release in 1927, and color films began to be produced around the same time.
Monkey spin, come on, let's play monkey spin. First you strap your monkey in, then when he's ready, give him a spin. You can have hours of fun, then check his eyesight when you're done. Monkey spin, now available in stores everywhere.
The 1930s was a completely different era, with the stock markets crashing and the Great Depression arising. Everyone lost their jobs, and it reflected greatly in their pop culture.
1930s fashion became less extravagant due to everyone's money lost during the Great Depression. Designer Coco Chanel, who ran the decade, introduced a more simple, business-like look, replacing the wild flapper dress with the little black dress. Men wore baggy knee pants known as +4s, and the invention of the zipper was created.
In the 1930s, people were filled with hardships. It was during the Great Depression and people had a lot of trouble. So as a result, their moods went straight down. Blues came out of this, which is a depressing branch of jazz music. Some of the songs consisted of Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? This title shows the hardships that people actually endured. Music really spoke to the people and tried to make them feel better. Also, during this time period, Congress designated the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem of the United States.
The 30s started with Joe DiMaggio debuting with the Yankees, and they won the World Series in 1936. Joe Louis was one of the best heavyweight boxers of this decade. The first ever World Cup was held in Uruguay, and they're the champions. Maple Leafs beat the Rangers in the Stanley Cup. Seabiscuit, a famous racehorse, won the Triple Crown.
Radio reached a zenith of popularity in this decade. By 1939, about 80% of the population owned radio sets. Americans love to laugh at the antics of such comedians as Jack Benny, Fred Allen, George Burns and Gracie Allen, Amos and Annie, and Fibber McGee and Molly. The soap opera dominated the daytime airwaves. Our Girl Sunday began each episode with the question, can a girl from a little mining town in the West find happiness as the wife of a wealthy and titled Englishman? Many a woman's ear was glued to her radio every day in hopes of learning the answer. The heroics of the Lone Ranger, the Green Hornet, the Shadow, and Jack Armstrong, all American, thrilled listeners, both young and old, and sold countless boxes of cereal. News broadcasts of commentators like H.V. Kaltenborn and Edward R. Murrow kept the public aware of the increasing crisis in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt used the medium in his fireside chats to influence public opinion. One of the most dramatic moments in radio history occurred on May 6, 1937, when the German airship Hindenburg burst into flames as it was about to land in Lakehurst, New Jersey. The horror of the incident was conveyed live by the reporter Herb Morrison. His reaction to what was happening in front of him still enthralls today. On October 30th, 1938, a 23-year-old Morrison Wells broadcast on his Mercury Theater of the Air. The H.G. Wells story War of the Worlds. Despite the disclaimer at the end of the program, the tale of the Martian invasion of Earth panicked a million listeners who mistook the play for a newscast. Such was the influence of radio in its golden age.
In the 1930s, Hollywood turned out movie after movie to entertain its Depression audience, and the 30s are often referred as Hollywood's golden age. Moviegoers wanted mainly escapist fare that let them forget their everyday troubles for a few hours. They swooned over such matinee idols as Clark Gable, Bette Davis, Greta Garbo, and Errol Flynn. They laughed at the likes of W.C. Fields, Bob Hope, and the Marx Brothers. America fell in love with the curly-headed Moppet, Shirley Temple, and flocked to see her tap dance and sing the song The Good Ship Lollipop. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers tapping and ballroom dancing across the screen enthralled the audience. Notable writers like William Faulkner and Scott Fitzgerald penned screenplays. Not all movies were fantasy and lightness. The picture version of Jock Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath brought the film story of the Joab family and its migration from the Dust Bowl to Oklahoma to the agriculture fields of California. One of the top money makers of all time, Gone with the Wind, debuted in Atlanta, Georgia in 1939. Walt Disney produced the first full-length animated movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937.
It's no secret that these 2 decades influenced pop culture of today. Trends such as the fedora have popped back into fashion, jazz songs are still enjoyed all over the world, and Hollywood remains to be the big king of showbiz.